becoming less respected. Americans are learning that the era of big government is upon us. And whether you consider yourself a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, your freedom to make choices for yourselves and your families is being influenced by government. One of my favorite quotes from Thomas Jefferson reads, "Of liberty, I would say that in the whole plenitude of its extent, it is unobstructed action according to our will. But rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within the limits drawn around us by equal rights of others." I did not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of an individual. Today I'm hopeful that Iowans and Americans are experiencing an awakening. I'm honored that scholars who are leading this awakening have chosen Dubuque, Iowa, as a venue to spread their message of true personal freedom. Each of us holds responsibility to maintain our freedoms, which is why our responsibilities do not end when we leave here today. We must talk with our friends, our families, and our neighbors to spread the message of personal liberty and freedom. In this age of globalism and uncertainty, one thing is definite. Our founding fathers have provided us a map to maintain our freedoms. It is up to us, we the people, to maintain these freedoms and reestablish the United States of America as the one true beacon of freedom in the world. I'll close with a quote from another founding father, Benjamin Franklin. "Those who would sacrifice freedom for security deserve neither." It is the words of our founding fathers that we must keep pressed to the forefronts of our minds today as we learn of the foundations of true personal liberty. Thank you for coming, and welcome to Dubuque.
Good afternoon. My name is David Fisher, and about 3 months ago, I was elected to be the new co-chairman for the Republican Party of Iowa. What that means for you is that you have gotten the consolation prize today. Regrettably, our chairman, A.J. Spiker, who would love nothing more than to be here today, is out in Los Angeles at the meeting of the Republican National Committee, working to keep our party at the national level from destroying itself. And I think he's having some success with that. The participant, unfortunately, had been rescheduled and it landed on top of that meeting, so he is not able to be here today, but I'm delighted to be here today. Would not have missed this. And AJ asked me to give you a bit of an update from the Republican Party of Iowa. And I'd say that, after November, a lot of Republicans were unhappy with the results of the elections. Frankly, things aren't as bad for the party as some have painted it to be. We still have a Republican at Terrace Hill. We control the Iowa House. We're just a few seats short of the Iowa Senate. But we've had some good results around the state, in county, and other local races. In fact, something that most people don't know is back on election night here in Iowa in November, did you know that more Republicans voted in that election than Democrats? That comes as a shock to a lot of people because the results of the vote didn't go as well for the Republicans as we would have hoped. But it tells you that independents broke over to the Democrat side on a lot of things. But we did turn out more of our Republicans than the Democrats did. The Republicans had a record in early voting and absentee voting. It's a way of voting that is controversial sometimes. So people say, well, the GOP isn't doing enough in that regard. But the GOP did turn out record numbers for absentee and early voting. Also, something I've learned from talking to AJ this week out in LA is he's out there with the chairs of all the other state parties and the national committee men and women, 168 people that make up the RNC, and he's learning of all these state GOP organizations that are broke. They're in debt. They're in a lot of debt, some of them. And I'm really happy to report that here in Iowa, the GOP, under current leadership, is financially very conservative and very sound. We are building momentum with fundraising. In fact, if you look at the Federal Election Commission reports filed so far this year, it says that Republicans in Iowa are raising about 5 times as much as the Democrats. So there's a resurgence happening. I find it really exciting when we have a party that is hosting events like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about, the direction of the party and where we're going, but this event here today is very much part of that. And the Iowa Democrats, on the other hand, have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And beyond that, our building that we have down in Des Moines, we all have outright. There's not a mortgage on that building. Our party in this state does not have 1 penny of debt or unpaid bills, and I'm happy to report that. Now, unfortunately, in spite of the health of the party here and what I think our prospects are for growing using a message like you're going to hear today, I have to agree, frankly, with Senator, or former Senator, rather, Jim DeMint from South Carolina, who recently left the Senate to head up the Heritage Foundation. Jim DeMint said about the time that he was leaving the Senate a few months ago that I believe that Republicans just have not been a reliable partner for the conservative cause. Ouch. That hurts, but that's a message that resonates with me. I think it resonates with a lot of people in this room. I think it resonates with a lot of the people that have risen to leadership positions in our party, in the state, and at the county levels as well. Republicans have got to be a clear alternative to the Democrats, not just some kind of an echo. When I ran to help lead this party at the state level, I didn't have any interest in being part of leading a party that just wants to grow the government a little slower than the other guys, or that just wants to raise taxes a little bit less than the other guys. That's not an alternative that I'm interested in. I made clear to the board of the party that voted for me to be co-chairman that I wasn't running for this position just to go around the state and be a cheerleader for anybody that hangs an R behind their name. That's not something that I'm just making up or think that that's my personal view of things. I know a lot of folks in this room are fans of the Constitution. Let's take a look. The Republican Party of Iowa has a Constitution too, if you've never happened to take a look at that. But that Constitution tells us what the purpose of this party is. And that's to advance the Republican Party's principles and policies. That's the purpose of the party. Now, yes, we need to raise money. It's going to take some money to advance those principles. But how much money we raise is not the measure of our success. Yes, we need to elect Republicans. We're going to need to elect some Republicans to help advance our principles. But just electing Republicans is not the measure of our success. Raising money and electing Republicans are things that we are going to do to help the ultimate goal of advancing our principles. And what are these principles I'm talking about? Well, the same grassroots delegates to the district and the state conventions that elected the board of directors that elected me, those are the same people who voted on and helped build the platform for the Republican Party. That's the embodiment of the principles that this party stands for. And you probably haven't all read the entire platform. It's pretty long. It has 28 sections. There are 395 planks in the platform. And while nobody will agree with all 395, we've got a very good, very conservative platform that I think that most of you would be pretty excited about most of what you read here. And those are the principles that we have to work to advance, or we are not going to be successful in 2014 in the elections in November. So here we are. It's not 2014 yet. We're in 2013. The presidential campaigns finally ended. We don't have a lot of primary campaigns coming together yet. They're starting to a little bit. But 2013 represents a real opportunity for us to, rather than focus entirely on the candidates and the person personalities that are involved in our party. We get to focus on the principles here in 2013. That's the vision that we have for 2013 for this party, is to celebrate the principles, because we can get separated on personalities pretty easily, because the personalities all represent the whole collection of principles. But if we focus on the principles, we can bring a lot of people together to support those principles, and we might support some candidates together more easily in the future. I think this is what unites us, is the principles of the party. And so we put together this year, for 2013, I hope you all pick up one of these on your way in. If you didn't, pick one up on the way out. We've got 12 different monthly themes that we're doing throughout this year to celebrate the principles that we stand for. We kicked off January with a big legislative breakfast that I got to host when our chairman was out of town another time, and that was fun. We hosted a pro-life event in Des Moines, and there's 28 sections in that platform. The first section is life. That's something that's a very important part of what this party is about, and we're going to champion that. And we did a big event in February down in Des Moines. We were trying to have this event with Dr. Woods in March. That had to get bumped up to April, but we've been active on the Second Amendment. In fact, I hadn't been co-chairman for 72 hours when our chairman was out of the country. And some Iowa legislator actually said to a newspaper reporter that we needed to start taking guns away from Iowans. He went beyond saying that there's certain weapons that should be banned. Said that we should be confiscating them from law-abiding Iowans. And these were very ordinary weapons. This wasn't anything unusual, any semi-automatic weapon. Well, there's room for disagreement, obviously, in our country. But this party, under its current leadership, when some elected member of our state legislative body is simultaneously stepping on both the Second and Fourth Amendments, this party's going to rise up and challenge that. And we should the state. Obviously, the Constitution is dear to us, and a lot of what we'll be talking about today has to do with that. We're going to have, Dr. Rand Paul, our next big event that was recently announced. That's not far away either. That's just down in Cedar Rapids, here in the 1st Congressional District, where we've got an open seat. We want to move the party over to Eastern Iowa. That event has oftentimes been done in Des Moines. And after his 13-hour filibuster that woke up the nation and got people really excited about people standing on the so we're all looking forward to that. We've stood up. You've probably seen the party. Now, there's been a lot of talk about raising the gas tax in Iowa. And people can talk about the pros and cons of that. We should not have Republicans advocating for raising taxes. That hurts our party. And we're going to object when elected people of either party are advocating for a principle that is 180 degrees opposite what the grassroots tells us this party is supposed to be about. And finally, we have seen this week, I issued a statement, the education reform legislation is moving down at the State House in Des Moines. There's lots of pros and cons to what's being discussed there too. It's a bit of a mixed bag, I'd say, when the House and the Senate are both weighing in on that. It's in the conference committee now. Apparently they've reached some kind of compromise. We've made clear, and this is based on what we learned from our platform as well, that if we're going to contemplate increases in state spending on education of hundreds of millions of dollars, if that's to be contemplated, at a minimum, we need to see to it that we are promoting alternatives to the public schools and making it easier for Iowa families to consider and be able to pay for things like private schooling and homeschooling. So I can't understand that message has been heard. Your party has made a clear stance on that, and hopefully we'll see some good stuff come out of that legislation. But stay tuned, because it's been made clear that is landmark legislation that we're working on. And if it doesn't do anything to expand education freedom, it's going to be hard to get grassroots Republicans to rally behind that kind of increase in government issues. So those are a lot of the things that we've been about this year, and are going to be about, and I'll be talking about some more of those things over the course of the day. But I want to get things moving with the program and introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is a friend of mine, Mr. Roger Kistler. He's from down the road in Jones County. He's been a Republican his entire life. In fact, this is kind of interesting. He became a Republican the same month that the 26th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, that allowed 18-year-olds to register to vote. He was 19 years old at that time, and he went and signed up. So he's got more Republican credentials I wager than anybody in the room. He served the party in a variety of positions at the local level down there in Jones County. He's worked in a number of industrial managerial positions, and his favorite thing to do is teaching in factories, in manufacturing. It's something that he likes to refer to as industrial strength teaching, and he's going to do some industrial strength teaching for us here this afternoon. Mr. Roger Kissel.
My name is Roger Kessler. My wife and I own a production machine shop in Jones County. I make screws for a living. You may wonder why a person makes screws for a living. We're standing in front of you today talking about monetary currencies. Well, let me explain. In 2006, my wife, son, and I traveled to China. And when we landed in Beijing, we could not help but notice there was a tremendous amount of construction taking place at the airport. Our Chinese guide said, yes, we're doubling the size of the airport thanks to the United States Federal Reserve. You mean the United States government, I said, thinking she was obviously there. No, I mean the Federal Reserve. There's a difference, you know. I didn't know. One random lady out of a population of 1.5 billion people knew something about my country that I didn't know. And today, what I'm going to do is share some of what I've learned since with you. Our story begins in 1607. That was the year that Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement, was founded in what was to become the United States of America. Of course, in those years, there was no United States of America. That didn't happen until 1787. Our Constitution was written and then subsequently ratified 2 years later. From 1607 until 1787 is 180 years. 180 years is a long time. For 180 years, there was no United States. Since there was no United States, there was no United States currency. This begs the question, what did the colonists use for money for 180 years? Now, if I ask this question in a classroom setting, someone will undoubtedly say, well, they bartered with the Indians. If one thinks about it, they bartered with the Indians is a very short-sighted answer. Let's say that you were one of the builders. You've been bouncing around on the ocean for 3 months, and you lost one of those big fancy brass buckles on one of your shoes. Where are you going to get a replacement? You're not going to barter with the Indians. They didn't have brass boundary. You're going to have to get it from Europe. Carrying this concept a little bit further, where did the colonists get glass for the window panes? Or cloth for their clothing? The Indians didn't have glass factories and they didn't have textile mills. Many of the items that the colonists wanted simply had to be imported. Very early on, the settlers of this country became experts in world trade. Sure, if they wanted corn, deer meat, or fur pelts, they traded with the Indians. But for 180 years, colonial life consisted of more than just corn, deer meat, and fur pelts. Thanks to John Rolfe's arrival in Jamestown in 1610, the first real currency of the colonies was introduced. It was tobacco. Wages were paid in tobacco, goods and services were purchased with tobacco, taxes were paid with tobacco. Perhaps more importantly, imported goods from Europe could be purchased with tobacco. Tobacco was a currency. Now, discovering that tobacco could be used as a currency was a tremendous breakthrough for the colonies. Prior to that, currency was regarded as something that only the king could issue. This is fundamental to understand. The American colonists broke free from the idea that they could only use a currency which, in essence, belonged to the king. In this new land, anyone who had something perceived to be of value could issue their own currency. The colonists were resourceful coming up with novel currency. I mentioned tobacco, animal skins, meat and grains were used as currency, musket balls and nails were used as currency. The Massachusetts colony passed a law making it illegal to burn down an abandoned building simply to get the nails. Belts of colored beads issued by the Indians called wampum was used as currency. At one time, you could pay your tuition to Harvard using wampum. Coins, particularly gold and silver coins, were the preferred currencies. The Dutch East India Company issued a lot of currency. Their coin, the VOC, was the backbone currency for what was later to become the state of New York. The Spanish mill dollar, or silver 8 reales coin, was a very popular currency. We know of this as the piece of 8. Spain mined silver in Mexico and minted 8 reales coins in Mexico City. It was a lot easier to take shipments of coins to the colonies than to go all the way to Spain with them. As a result, the Spanish mill dollar was used extensively in this country for many years. In fact, the Spanish mill dollar was legal tender in this country until the Coinage Act of 1857. This just simply means that you could pay United States taxes with Spanish money. Now let's see. 1857 minus 1607 is 250 years. Now, going shopping with a bushel of wheat strapped to your back was not particularly convenient. Furthermore, raccoon pelts and deer skins didn't fit all that well into the pants pockets. To solve these problems, the early colonists, being resourceful as they were, decided that carrying around paper bills of credit that could be redeemed for a particular commodity, there you go, that could be redeemed for a particular commodity of value was a lot easier than toting around the commodity itself, especially if the commodity was land. These bills of credits were particularly championed by a young printer by the name of Benjamin Franklin. With the advent of paper currency, the economy of the colonies exploded. Individuals, businesses, and even the colonies themselves got into the act. Not only was there free market competition among goods and services, but there was free market competition among currencies as well. For example, Rhode Island paid interest on its currency to encourage its use. But, and this is important, all bills of credit could be redeemed for something that was perceived to be of value. That is, until the Continental Congress entered the picture. As the events of history progressed, it became more and more evident that a revolutionary war would soon be at hand. To finance such a conflict, the Continental Congress needed money. It decided to print its own bills of credit. After all, there were many groups that were successfully doing this. They called their currency the Continental currency. Now, the Continental Congress was a group of people who thought that the colonies should become independent states. The Continental Congress did not own land. It did not raise crops. It did not carry on trade. It did not manufacture anything. The Continental Congress could not even tax anyone. The Continental Congress certainly did not have a warehouse full of silver. The colonists knew this. There was no perceived value to the Continental currency. They avoided using it. Free market competition being what it is, the Continental currency failed. Reacting to this failure, the Continental Congress did what most governments would do. They printed more. This ultimately caused the currency to be, well, not worth the Continental. The Continental currency debacle was such a disaster that it was specifically written into the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress could only coin money, thus assuring that there was actually something backing the currency. Furthermore, in Article 1, Section 10, the Constitution says that the states, quote, cannot make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, end quote. That's something to keep in mind when you get your state income tax refund. The time period between the Revolution and Civil War is regarded as the free banking era. There were literally thousands of currencies in circulation at the time. Albeit important, the federal government's currency was just one of many. One particular currency that I find fascinating was that was issued by the Dubuque Land Company. It was a currency circulated in the area where I live. If the redeeming species for this currency was land along the Wassapinican River here in Iowa. If you didn't like holding the paper, you could cash it in for a plot of land along the Wassapinican River. Currencies like this were understandably very regional in nature. A bill of credit for land along the Wassapinican River would not be particularly appealing to someone living in, say, New Hampshire. Not everyone liked the concept of free market multiple currencies. Some believe that the federal government should have a strong central bank. One particularly outspoken critic of free market multiple currencies was a young politician by the name of Abraham Lincoln. After being inaugurated as president in March of 1861, Lincoln wasted no time in implementing his plan. The following August, the United States issued a paper currency known as demand notes. The paper was redeemable for gold upon demand. Because the color on the back of the bill was green, they were nicknamed greenbacks. Since the Constitution did not allow the federal government to print money, Americans were extremely wary of this currency. They cashed them in. In December 1861, just 4 months after their issue, the United States government suspended specie redemption for the greenback. The greenback had failed. Reacting to this failure, the United States Congress did what most governments do. They printed more money. But this time, to reassure the population that the greenbacks were indeed legal, Congress added a special message to the backside of the bill that said, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." We find that message in our currency today. The greenback was still not successful. So Congress passed the National Banking Act of 1863, thus creating national banks. Now this, in my opinion, was one of the most brilliant pieces of legislation our Congress has ever produced. National banks work like this. If 5 or more investors had $50,000, they could deposit their money, gold, with the United States Treasury, then issue up to 90% of what they had on deposit as their own currency. This was a fail-safe system. Even if there was a run on a particular bank and everyone cashed in their paper money for gold, the bank would still have 10% gold in reserve. The bank would not fail. The National Banking Act of 1863 allowed unprecedented prosperity throughout the country, especially in small-town America. In the county where I live, Jones County, there were 5 banks that issued their own currency. One was in Olin, one was in Wyoming, one was in Monticello, and there were 2 in Anamosa. At one time, there were over 10,000 small towns that issued their own currency. Because national banknotes were backed by deposits in the United States Treasury, the currency was honored throughout the entire United States. Once again, I'll remind you that not everyone liked the concept of free market multiple currencies. Enter the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Federal Reserve. We can think of the Federal Reserve as being a special bank created by Congress. It's not a government agency. I say it was a special bank because it had some special features that the national banks did not have. It could print its own lawful money. That's no big deal. The national banks could print theirs as well. However, while national banks needed to have gold in reserve to back their currency, the Federal Reserve did not. It simply needed to have lawful money in reserve. Well, now let's see. It printed lawful money. Therefore, if the Federal Reserve wanted to say have $100 in currency circulating, it just simply had to print $135 and keep 35 of it just printed in reserve. But this is very important. Federal Reserve notes were fully redeemable for gold. Pretend for a minute that this is 1931. You are one of the 5 investors of your hometown national bank. You deposited $100 of gold with the United States Treasury. There's $90 of your paper money circulating around in your community. For some reason, everyone who holds your currency wants to cash it in. There's a run on your head. When the dust settles, you have $10 in gold on reserve. You wipe your forehead, you're still in business. Then along comes somebody with a $50 bill from the Federal Reserve. They ask you to redeem it for gold. You explain you don't have $50 in gold. You only have $10 in gold. They say, that's okay, I'll take it. And they leave. Your bank just became insolvent. Your bank just failed. This scenario was repeated hundreds of times in the Depression years. One by one, the national banks failed. One by one, currency issued by the people was taken out of circulation. As a result, today we use but only one currency, the Federal Reserve note. From 1607 until 1913 is 306 years. For over 300 years, our country grew and prospered using multiple currencies. Whether the gold was tobacco, silver, or raccoon pelts, the people issued currency. From 1913 until 2013 is 100 years. It is not an exaggeration to suggest that 100 years ago, economically, the United States began reverting back to its pre-Revolutionary War status. Today, we use only one currency issued by one organization, a king, if you will. We must be ever mindful, as we review our nation's history of the last 100 years, of the golden rule of economics. The one who has the gold makes the rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger, for that message. That was well received and very appropriate, even with the program. I think I'm going to jettison a couple items here to keep us moving along here, because everyone's excited to hear from our featured speaker. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce him now. Our speaker today is renowned across America as a historian and a constitutional scholar of the original intent. He is an economic visionary. He has an undergraduate degree from Harvard, of all places, and a handful of graduate degrees from Columbia. So he certainly comes with the credentials. But beyond that, he is a New York Times best-selling author of, I think he's up to 11 books now. And I'm happy to report that 7 of those books are in my library. And I'm hoping that he will have the 4th one today. big government before the coming fiscal collapse. One of my favorites is Meltdown from a few years ago, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. See, when you get this much intellectual firepower, you can't just call a book Meltdown. When you're as smart as this guy, the title of your book has to be this long. You just can't pack enough into a little title like that. The politically incorrect guide to American history, that's a fun read. 33 questions about American history that you're not supposed to ask. That's a fun read too. Also, how the Catholic Church built Western civilization. And the church in the market, a Catholic defense of the free market. Those are interesting topics as well that we can learn a lot from. But at this time, I'd like to introduce him. He's my friend. He's been to Iowa a number of times. We hope to do more events like this. You know, Fox News analyst, Judge Napolitano, we all familiar with The judge calls this guy the smartest guy in the room. And I'm sure at the end of the day, you're going to agree. Let me introduce the smartest guy in the room, Dr. Tom Rhodes.
Well, first of all, thanks very much to the Republican Party of Iowa for putting on this event, and thanks to all you folks from here and from various parts of the state for being here. I'm very, very grateful. It's a little odd standing here actually in a pulpit. People say that we worship the free market. I try to say, no, and here I am. And incidentally, there were some, I don't know if you noticed, we had some protesters outside, and I thought I'd rather talk to them. Because that's just who I am, you know. I want to talk to these people. And you'll get a kick out of this, but I actually thought I had charmed them into going away. Apparently I didn't. I'm not a miracle worker here. I do my best. I have 4 young daughters. I leave every time I go on a trip. Now, my mother lives about 10, 15 minutes from our house, so my mother keeps them once in a while when my wife joins me on a trip. But I can't help mentioning, especially given the topic that I'm covering here, this first topic, I can't help mentioning just a little something about one of them. I know you're sick and tired of hearing people talk about their kids, rolling on all day with their kids. And, oh, my kids are so smart. You're just dying to jump out a window and escape. I'll just tell you, this is my oldest daughter. The eldest, she is 9.5, going on 59.5. But back when she was 7, she was having a little chit-chat with a friend of hers, and they were talking about some old-timey story that one of them had read from the 19th century. And the idea of penny candy figured heavily into the story. And this friend of hers said to my daughter, Regina, I think this story is totally ridiculous. I mean, everybody knows you can't buy anything for a penny. And my Regina said, yeah, thanks to the Fed. Bear in mind, even when you think they're not listening in to your conversation or can't possibly understand what you're saying, don't underestimate them. Gosh, she makes me proud. I was joking, telling you that. Well, what I want to do today is 3 things in this first little talk here. The first one is I want to say that it's good to favor low taxes and fewer regulations, right? We're more or less in agreement on this. But that's not enough. That's not enough to give us the economy we need, and it's not enough in order to understand the economy. We have to understand more about free market economics than simply taxes discourage job creation. That's an important principle, but we have more that we need to learn. The second thing is there is an elephant in the room when we talk about the economy, and I want to acknowledge that elephant. And the third thing is that if we're going to support the free market economy, we have to support it across the board if we're going to be credible. If we keep making exceptions, then it's no surprise that our opponents are going to think that we're not really sincere, that really we are in some ways just self-interested when we talk about the free market. So we can't do that. So first things first. So it's right, it's true that, as David mentioned, I wrote this book, Meltdown, and it came out in early 2009. And the purpose of this book was to talk about what in the world had just happened to the economy and why. Because I knew that if we didn't get our point of view out there, the conventional wisdom would ossify very quickly. And that conventional wisdom, we all know it. We all know what the conventional wisdom is. You stupid rubes had too much freedom, and look what you went and did. You went and created a big housing bubble, and now we, your wise overlords, have to go clean up the mess that you stupid idiots created. And so in doing that, we're going to need more power, and more go, and more regulations. But I guess we'll just have to reluctantly accept this. Yeah, they just hate taking more power. If we absolutely have to, we'll do it. Now, that's the view that you would get watching TV these days, right? It just goes, capitalism caused the problem. And I thought, if I hear this one more time, I'm going to go out and commit an atrocity. So much better to write a book. Take that energy and book it. Now, why do I actually come here and show off? Is it because I want you to go out and buy copies of this book at my book table? No. It's because I want to let you know, with my wife's signature, this was a rotten experience. Let me just tell you something here. Normally I enjoy writing my books, but this book, I was under a tremendous deadline because the publisher said, everyone in the world is going to write a book about what they're wrong with the economy. And there are going to be people better known than Tom Woods, so you better hurry up and get yours out first, or you're just going to be lost in an avalanche of books. Okay, so how soon do you want this book? I better not tell you the answer because you're going to think this book must be a piece of garbage. I tell you how little time they gave me. But let me just tell you, it was a shockingly small amount of time. Absolutely shocking. And then they realized, wait a minute, we forgot publishing closes down around Christmas time for 2 weeks. So could you have it to us 40% sooner than we asked for originally? It was unreasonable the first time. So this was like the worst X week period. I can't tell you what X equals. I mean, it was just horrifying. Now, I would work after the kids were in bed. I always played with the kids. That's not negotiable. But after the kids were in bed, it was just like work, all day long. So you know what? Now that I think about it, yes, I would like to pick up a copy. Yeah. But the point of it, as I say, was to go out there and explain the path. Because I think there were a lot of good, decent, pro-free market people out there who really didn't know what to say. They'd been blindsided by this. And all their friends are telling them, you stupid idiot, your ideas caused this. And I wanted to show that's really not true. I mean, banking is the most heavily regulated sector of the whole economy. Given that at the time, we had 115 regulatory bodies at the federal and state level. I mean, what are these people? What does Rachel Maddow want us to think? That if only we had 116 regulatory bodies, then we would have. I'm not going to go for this. So I wanted to give a different point of view. Now, it turns out there were people who warned that something was wrong. Something's wrong with the economy. These people warned about this for several years leading up to the crash of 2008. For example, there's a guy on television who would be on a lot of these cable news programs named Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff would go on there and say, the economy's in big trouble. This housing market's a lot of phony baloney housing bubble. It's not real. This is phony wealth, and it's going to crash. And he told this to the Mortgage Brokers Association and people who, last people on earth want to hear this story. That's what he's telling them. He goes to these stations and he says, you shouldn't buy Merrill Lynch. You should sell. Get out of this. It's going to be a disaster. And people were literally laughing. You could hear them laughing on the set, on CNN and Fox News. They're all laughing at everything's fine. What's the matter with this book? And it turns out everything unfolds exactly as he said it would. And you would think a whole lot of these commentators who laughed at him would apologize or say, or maybe you had some insight that I lacked. And basically, no, they just keep on yapping like nothing happened. You'd think they would have enough shame to, retire to a monastery or something. The only person who had the decency to say, Schiff was right and I was wrong, I just missed this completely, was Ben Stein. Otherwise, everybody just carried on. So Schiff became something of a celebrity because one of his fans out there combined all these clips of him on TV with people laughing at him and put it into a YouTube video called Peter Schiff Was Right. It's now had a couple of million views. this guy know? It so happens that in 2001, on the floor of the U.S. Congress, there was a certain congressman who said, well, we've just lived through a tech bubble where tech stocks were bid way up, and everybody thought, great, I better buy tech stocks, and doorknobs.com is going to make me rich, and everybody just thought that any old internet site was going to make them rich, and then bam, we had the crash. This congressman said, well, we just lived through that, and that was fueled by the Federal Reserve, and now the Federal Reserve is creating a housing, a real estate bubble to replace this burst bubble, and this one is going to burst just as surely as that one did. That was 2001. I'm going to leave it to your imagination which congressman that was. Nope, did you listen to that? Yeah, no. Keep on buying. Keep on buying those houses. Nobody listen. In fact, there was, I don't want to mention any other names. I haven't mentioned any yet, other than should. But there was a certain candidate, Republican candidate for president in 2012, who 1 week before the crash in 2008 was saying everything's fine. 1 week before the worst crash we've had since the Great Depression. 1 week, everything's fine. Anybody complaining is just part of the liberal media. Okay. We gotta be better than this. Okay, we gotta be better than this. How do these people know? That's the question. How do they know? Were they using tarot cards or tea leaves or a medium or a Ouija board? Like, how would they do all that? I'm against all that stuff. I don't think you should be tampering with that stuff. You can use the old noodle to figure this stuff out. And it so happens that the people who warned us that this was a problem, that there was a problem with the economy, and it wasn't caused by the Republicans, and it wasn't caused by the Democrats, it was caused by a whole bunch of them. The way they knew was that they belonged to a certain school of economic thought. They belonged to what's called the Austrian School of Economics. Now, this has nothing to do with the country of Austria. This is a school of thought, like Milton Friedman comes from the Chicago School. But you could be a Chicago School economist even if you've never visited Chicago. Well, likewise, I've never been to Austria, but I think of myself as an Austrian school economist. The Austrians are a school of thought going back to 1871. And they are enjoying a bit of a renaissance right now because 99% of the people who warned that there was something wrong with the economy all belong to this school. So suddenly people want to know, who are these people? Now, normally, 20 years ago, what would have happened is people would have said, who are these people? And there would have been dead silence because the New York Times is going to tell you. Washington Post is going to tell you. CBS Evening News is going to tell you. But now we have the internet. So, CBS Evening News could, go whatever CBS Evening News goes and does. And New York Times doesn't matter what they say because we have the internet. We can get videos out there, we can get articles out there. Now people are interested. How did they know? Now the Austrian school, the most illustrious member of it in the 20th century was this economist Ludwig von Mises. Now in the old days, everybody in the conservative movement knew who Ludwig von Mises was. And unfortunately, the conservative movement today is doing a terrible job teaching its own history. Because now it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Mises, I've never heard of this guy. Ludwig von Mises was a professor of economics, but more than that, in 1912, he's 31 years old in 1912, he writes a book called The Theory of Money and Credit. And in that book, he basically describes what happens when you have policies like we just had the end of the housing bubble. Well, let's describe that, and then here will be the result. He did that 100 years before the events took place. Well, again, a guy may be worth looking into. Totally blackballed by the economics profession after the 1940s. Again, a guy with insight like you wouldn't believe. One of the only people in the 1920s who said the so-called prosperity of the 20s is not going to go on forever, and the crash is going to come sooner or later. Then the crash comes. We never hear Mises' name, doesn't come up anymore. He's not invited to conferences. He's spoiling the party. Doesn't Mises know that was just practice, the Great Depression? We're just trying to fine-tune things. We'll get it right. So Mises was extraordinarily productive. And then, living in 1930s Europe, at a time when the Nazis are gaining power, Mises finds himself in an uncomfortable spot. He's teaching in Switzerland, and his papers and books are confiscated back in Vienna. And he and his wife decide they just got to get out of Europe. It's not a safe place for a free market Jewish professor to be anymore. And so in 1940, they get to the Iberian Peninsula. In 1940, they flee to the United States, almost empty-handed. And you would think, okay, now he is 59 years old, coming to the U.S. with no academic position, believe his career is over. And yet, his career was just getting started. In the 1940s, he writes 3 books. One of them is 900 pages long. Human Action. Now, you think economics, oh, that's really boring. Economics is boring. No, economics is boring only if you have some doofus teaching it. There's no reason this should be boring. Now, I'm happy to say that Meltdown became a New York Times bestseller because the economy was bad and people want to know why it was bad. Normally, you try to sell a book on the economy, it really doesn't move. It doesn't go anywhere. But during